Today is November 12th, 2010. My name is Audrey Emrine Beardsley. I'm an associate professor at Arizona State University. I've created a show with David Berliner titled Inside the Academy that's sponsored by the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College and the Applied Learning Technologies Institute at Arizona State University. Today, I'm speaking with and in admiration of Edmund Gordon, Professor of Psychology Emeritus at Yale University and Teachers College, Columbia, but also minister, clinical and counseling psychologist, research scientist, writer, citizen, father and husband, and chef. Welcome to Inside the Academy.
Thank you.
It is a pleasure to honor you. You were born in 1921 in North Carolina?
Correct.
Tell us about your childhood.
Let's see now. In North Carolina in 1921, my town was a small tobacco market town. The farmers in that area grew a little bit of cotton, but mostly tobacco. And the bright leaf tobacco market was kind of centered in that region. It was a town of maybe 10,000 people, highly segregated. We lived on the border of the black community and the white community, about a block from downtown. My father was a physician. He happened to have migrated to this country from Jamaica. And he never gave up his British passport because in those days, black people who were not continent born were treated differently from black people who were. And as long as he carried his British passport, he was less subject to the segregation of the period than were African American folk. He had been in practice during the flu epidemic that hit the country in 1918 and 19, right after the First World War. And he actually didn't become wealthy, but he became very comfortable.
Oh.
So all through the Great Depression, of course, which marked my childhood in the 30s, we were really quite privileged. We never suffered from the economic deprivation that so many people suffered from that in that time. My mother had been an elementary school teacher before she married. She had become a housewife after she married, and devoted her time to making sure that two of her children moved ahead. I say two, because her first child, my oldest brother, had been a mentally retarded person. He was injured at birth. And we never had much of a sibling relationship. But Mrs. Mabel Gordon really invested just about all of her energy in the nurturance of her daughter Rose and her son Ed. Sent us off to Howard University, which was then regarded as the capstone of Negro education. She made sure that we would become well-educated people, and there was never much of a question but that we would go to college and that we should do well there. I disappointed her because I went there, and after 3 semesters of playing around, they asked me to leave for poor scholarship. And my poor mother was devastated as that. She sent me up to Philadelphia to live for a semester with my uncle, her next oldest brother, who had raised 3 daughters, all of whom were Phi Beta Kappa. And he was supposed to turn me around.
Wow.
And I suppose he did, as I went back to Howard and managed to keep going after them.
And you got your degree in zoology?
I got my first degree in biology.
Okay.
And my first postgraduate degree was in theology from Howard.
Okay.
Actually, it was in social ethics from the School of Religion there at Howard. I make that distinction because I have really never aspired to be, nor spent much time in the ministry. I was much more interested in both theology and the way in which it informed social ethics and in human services. And within 3 years after I had finished divinity school, I was back in school in psychology because I discovered that my theological preparation was not good preparation for what I really wanted to do, which at that time was to counsel people. So that's how I went back to graduate school to do my work in counseling psychology.
And that was at Teachers College, correct?
At Teachers College.
And you got your doctorate?
At Teachers College.
And what did you study for your dissertation?
I wrote my dissertation on the mental health problems of children in Harlem and a community-based approach to their treatment. It was one of the early efforts at either bypassing or doing an end run around psychoanalytic approaches to therapy, to the incorporation of community psychology and phenomenological approaches to intervention. Right.
You have been married to Susan G. Gordon, MD, pediatrician, since 1948, over 60 years of marriage. Tell us about Susan.
Well, it was last Friday, I guess it was, last Saturday. It was 62 years, November 6, 1948.
Happy anniversary.
Susan, thank you. Susan's a pediatrician, but a lot more than that. She's a social activist. She's a humanitarian. She's a humanist. She's a political radical. And with all of that, the mother of 4 children, she practiced medicine for a few years. When I think our 3rd child was born, she realized that the demands of private practice were more than a mother could handle, so she went into academic medicine. She taught pediatrics at New York Medical College initially, finished her career, I guess the last 20 years of it were at Columbia Presbyterian. She was recognized by her students for her excellence in teaching. So many times we had to create almost a special room for her awards. She's just a remarkable person.
What are your secrets to such a successful marriage?
I don't know. It certainly helps if you find solid people. Marriage is not the place for weak characters, because even though we've been married happily for 62 years and really been a pair for 2 years more than that, almost 64, I think that the fact that she was both a decent and a very strong person, and I like to think of myself as having my act together, I think that helped considerably.
It seems that you both are very oriented towards service, serving the well-being as well.
Yeah. I would have said it a little bit differently if you had asked me that. I think what is at the core is a kind of respect for ourselves and for other people. And that respect leads us to feel responsible for nurturing and helping other people. One of the earliest memories I have of my interactions with my father was his having said to me one day when I had done something to indicate how much I appreciated the fact that we were privileged. He says, you know, privilege has its responsibility. He says, if you've got more than other people, then that makes you even more responsible for helping them. And that kind of has never gotten away from me. And of course was delighted when I discovered in Susan that she had much the same approach to life. She had also come out of an even more privileged family than my own. And her father, who was a newspaper publisher, had taught her that the only way she could really justify the privileges that she was enjoying was to share them with other people. So yeah, both of us are very much committed.
Have that in common.
But I think being good people, being strong people are all important and necessary. But loving each other probably is the core of
the core ingredient.
Right.
You claim your children are your most important achievements in your history. Here's what they have to say about you. Your daughter Jessica, she agrees that your most significant accomplishment was what you achieved with Susan, raising 4 accomplished and lovely human beings who do good in this world. What were your goals as their father?
You know, I don't think I ever articulated to myself or to Susan or even to them goals for them. I think implicitly I probably was trying to do for them what my parents had done for me. I certainly wanted them to grow up to be decent people. When I retired the first time, I've tried to retire several times now, but when I retired the first time, they threw a big party for me. Actually, it was a conference. And my oldest son was the last speaker. And he said a lot of nice things, but one of the things he said that impressed me most was that he and his siblings had learned from their parents that there were probably no problems they would encounter in life that they couldn't solve if they were willing to apply their minds to them. And I remember that night Susan and I were talking about it, and neither of us could remember ever having said that to them. But somehow one of the things that we were teaching them was to use their minds in the service of other people. And I guess I would have to say implicitly that was the goal.
That was the goal.
To help these young people grow up as intellectually competent folk who knew how to use what they had to serve other people.
And on that note, she says that you are the most intellectual person she has ever met and one of the most dedicated human beings she knows. But she did say that you were so dedicated that you actually brought work with you one time to a dinner party. Do you recall?
Not one time.
Plenty of times.
I still do.
Oh, you do?
I don't like to waste time. And most social events, after a while, people, particularly if they're drinking, start telling the same stories. So you got to be there, have something to do.
She also said one of your biggest weaknesses is that you cannot bluff when you play cards. Do you grin?
I think it's true. I suspect I can't bluff in any situation. One of my mentors, Dr. Wilkerson, died a few years ago. And at his memorial service, his nephew was talking about Uncle Doxy. And he said Uncle Doxy was one of the most open people I've ever known. He said, you got from him exactly what you see. And I hope people get from me exactly what they see.
Hence, you can't bluff. We see it. Your son Chris also thanks you for instilling in him a love for learning and a passion for serving the greater good. He describes you as you sometimes describe yourself, a humanist, and as such, a firm believer that it is the responsibility of those who have been privileged to use the fruits of that privilege, regardless of their manifestation, to help those who are less well off. What inspired you to live your life in this service to others?
I probably answered that a couple of minutes ago in talking about my parents, and particularly my father. My mother enjoyed her status and privilege. I do not think of her as being isolated from the social fray, but she was not nearly as likely to wade into it and try to do something about it as my father. He certainly lived his life as a servant leader. He was out with the people constantly and helping, and he was the person that people in my community turned to if they were in trouble or needed help or were sick or whatever it is. Right.
Your daughter Johanna remembers a long time ago, one cold fall day in New England, you were dedicating a memorial to W.E.B. Du Bois, and out of nowhere came an elderly man dressed who called himself Mr. Lovejoy. Do you remember that? You offered him a sandwich and a cup of hot soup. She says it's always amazing to her when she meets a stranger who tells her how you have touched their lives. Okay, tell us about the Harriet Tubman Clinic for Children you co-founded in Harlem in 1952.
Susan and I have lived quite independent lives with her career in pediatrics and mine in education and psychology. But we have, from the beginning, tried to do things together. And back in the early 50s, it must have been 51 or 52, shortly after we moved to New York and she finished her internship. We opened this little office in Harlem, and we called it the Harriet Tubman Clinic in honor of Harriet Tubman, who had led so many black people out of enslavement. I had a small private practice there. Susan worked at the hospital, and I was pretty much responsible for running our clinic, which was not for profit. In fact, I don't think we even charged people for it. If we did, not very much. Because after about 9 years, when our money ran out, we had to close it because it was bankrupt. But the Harriet Tubman Clinic was a children's health and guidance clinic. We took care of their physical health and their mental health. And my approach to mental health was a community development, parental strengthening, social interventionist approach to mental health. So that, which I think I told you I wrote about in my dissertation. So that the Tubman Clinic was less a traditional psychotherapeutic treatment center and probably more of a social service, social action center. I mentioned social action there in juxtaposition to service because even then we had somehow come up with the notion, which I probably got from some interactions I had with W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois believed that the best help you could provide for people was to strengthen them in their capacity to help themselves. And I remember in those days we were trying to give meaning to that notion through our clinic, trying to strengthen families and kids themselves in their capacity to assert themselves and to help themselves and, in a sense, cure themselves.